Shall we start with this Daily Mail
Sure.
story, two-tier justice? This is guidance agreed in January, which is going out to all the courts from the Sentencing Council, independent of ministers, saying that you have to take into account the background of offenders, including their ethnic background. I think to be fair to ministers, and she issued a statement saying that she thought they should withdraw it. The problem is independent judiciary, independent sentencing council. This is what they've said the judges should do. It's one of those times as a minister where you find stuff out and it's a nightmare.
Well, look, I mean, I think ultimately we've got a democratic system where ministers decide. And yes, you've got to take into account what the proposal is, but I think it would be a very dangerous route for Labour and the Labour government, frankly, to go down this path. And you've got to remember, in justice, it's not actually the reality, it's the perception of what's going on that's often just as important. And it would have been very difficult, I think, for her and for the government to say, yes, we should have a sentencing system which takes into account people's ethnic background or their
But that means ministers override the independent sentencing council and start to tell the judges how they should sentence.
No, it doesn't mean that you do that all the time. But ultimately, ministers decide. They're the ones who've been elected. We have a rule of a government that goes to the House of Commons. We don't have a rule of lawyers. That would be a different political system, which we don't have.
Aisha, so these guidelines suggest that ethnic minority criminals may be more likely to avoid prison, according to the Mail, and transgender criminals may be more likely to avoid prison. Can you see any rationale which would justify that?
No, absolutely not. And I do think sometimes the people working on the sort of that side of things, the independent judiciary, also have to sort of think about the court of public opinion, and they have to have a bit of a sense check. Crime, I would say, is such a huge issue in this country right now. I've spoken about this in your programme, I've spoken about it in the House of Lords as well. A lot of people feel their lives are being blighted by crime. It's called low-level crime. It's not low-level at all, whether it's shoplifting, whether it's antisocial behaviour. We know that there are prolific offenders that are committing huge amounts of crime. The idea that you're going to get a pass because you're an ethnic minority or a transgender person, that is completely ridiculous. And I'm glad that the Justice Secretary has spoken out and said, she herself is from an ethnic minority background. She's the first, Muslim Lord Chancellor we've ever had. She represents a very ethnically diverse... In fact, I actually was in a meeting with her yesterday. There was a meeting about kind of crime and justice issues, and she made it really, really clear that just because you're from an ethnic minority background or you're a minority, it doesn't mean you get some kind of pass. The only thing I would say, though, in terms of one of the things that many people have talked about is, I think, and some of your audience might not like this, but I think if women are getting put in for low-level crime continuously, there is a case for examining that, because there's a big social cost to mums going into, who are, drug addicts or maybe prostitutes. They've had domestic violence, they have mental health issues. There is a kind of piece of work being done to look at, is there a better way to divert women away from prison, particularly if they've got young children and they haven't committed really, really serious offences. But on the whole, we've got to take this stuff seriously.
So last year, there was new Sentencing Council guidance which for the first time spelt out that courts and judges should consider mitigating factors before passing a sentence.
Yeah.
These were new guidelines last year, separate to these new guidelines which are going to be coming in on April the 1st, which are about transgender criminals and ethnic minority criminals. And this guidance that came out last year said the mitigating factors included poverty, low educational attainment, experience of discrimination and insecure housing. And the reason that caused a big row was because there was a case earlier this year where a defence lawyer told the court that a drug-dealing couple who were parents felt they had no other alternative other than to embark on drug dealing because one of them was unemployed and one of them was on minimal wage.
No, I think that's completely unacceptable. And actually, one principle of British justice is equal before the law. That's the phrase. And that means that it should be impartial, regardless of what your circumstances are and regardless of what your social or ethnic or religious background is. That's a core principle, has been a core principle of British justice.
That's not what these sentencing guidelines...
I think that's a problem. They're importing
officials
a whole bunch of social
with.
factors to try and mitigate or essentially discriminate between different types of people.
But if you had somebody here from the Sentencing Council, I don't know, these are independent judicial figures, I think they would probably say that their worry is that you end up de facto giving different sentences to different individuals if they look different, and that therefore part of what they're trying to do here is make sure we don't end up by mistake giving longer sentences to people from a particular ethnic minority background, and therefore the guideline is to do exactly what you said. They're trying to make sure that it's blind to
ethnicity. It's not blind, because you're saying...
By the way, I'm not saying this. I'm trying to imagine what they would say. They would say they're trying to do what you want, which is to stop de facto racism happening by mistake.
It should be blind. OK, justice should be blind.
But it can't be blind, because in the court, as the judge about to do the sentence, you see the defendant in front of you, so it's not blind.
You should address that problem. You shouldn't try and retilt the balance.
I know.
But but I think, look, to your point, I think that's a fair point to raise, and it is something that, as policymakers, you don't want a situation when you look at there's an unwitting, unconscious bias, and it is true to say that often you will hear cases of, let's say, a very affluent, white middle-class person who's had, up for something, and the judge will say, well, actually, because you've got a really good character and because you've been a nice middle-class person, you've got your neighbours say you're lovely, and, you've been part of the Rotary Club and stuff like that.
That's right.
So it can go that way. But what I would say, in order to mitigate your concerns, let's look at who...
By the way, I always be the sentencing...
I know, you're playing devil's advocate, I get that. But there is an argument, if you look at the judiciary and if you look at who is meting out justice, it isn't very diverse. What would help from this point of view is to have more diverse judges so that there wasn't that accusation. The other thing that the government is looking to do, which is, I think, really interesting as well, is reduce the number of cases that go to Crown Court, because there is such a backlog in the court. Brian Levison, a very esteemed judge, is doing a big review of that. And I think you're going to see magistrates having a bigger role. And so I think if you have a more diverse judiciary, from magistrates right up to judges, that will help to counter, I think, those anxieties.
And the big point I would make, lastly, is that the perception of this is really important. We've got a world where you've got the Reform Party on 25%, you've got people who are broadly very disaffected with what's going on in the political establishment world, for want of a better phrase. And this idea that, you're going to have different sentences depending on where your ethnic background is extremely controversial. And I can see why the government have rejected it.
Yeah, although, as we say, they might try to reject it, but it's an independent body. And just speaking for the Sentencing Council, Lord Justice William Davis says, the guideline emphasises the crucial role played by pre-sentence reports. They provide the court with information about the offender. They are not an indication of sentence, which seems to undercut the story altogether.
Who would have thought? Who would have thought, Susanna? Surely not.
Anyway, just wanted to put that out there.
No.
OK, let's talk about what on earth is now going on in the world. Because there was,
it's all gone mad.
We're talking about all of this at the same time as, I don't know if you felt a sort of ice cube down the back of the neck moment yesterday, when China announced it was prepared for any type of war. I mean, talk about fighting talk. I thought, hang on a moment, what's going on now? Is this the beginning of World War III? Well, they're retaliating, of course, about the tariffs, the extra taxes put by President Trump on goods from China. But my goodness, you don't mess around with a phrase like we're prepared for any type of war and saying that they're ready to fight till the end. How dangerous a moment is this?
It's a brilliant quote.
It's pretty scary. Look,
just read the actual quote. If the war... this is the Chinese embassy in Washington. If war is what the US wants, be it a tariff war, a trade war, or any other type of war, we're ready to fight till the end. I mean...
It's very belligerent. Look, but there's no escaping the fact that President Trump, has totally upset the apple cart of the kind of global order we had. And with these tariffs, I mean, I've just come back from Canada, and I was there when he announced them, and they were freaking out. I mean, they were really, really upset. I mean, they put a brave face to it. But can you imagine a 25% tax on everything you export into your neighbouring country? Is pretty brutal. And the US is a big part of the Canadian economy. And all these other countries are realising that this is a real problem for them. And they're trying to push back, and they're trying to say, look, you know, we're not going to be bullied around, we're not going to be pushed around. And I'm afraid that rhetoric is part of that. They're trying to say, look, we can stand up for ourselves, and we're not going to be bullied by you, President Trump.
Aisha, can tariff wars start wars?
Absolutely. And, of course, people forget that when there's tariffs, it's the ordinary consumer who ends up, you know, paying a huge amount sort of more. Interestingly, last night, though, having talked very tough on these 25% tariffs, the White House indicated that Trump might be reconsidering this, mainly because his own automotive industry have absolutely gone bonkers at this. So so you're dealing with somebody who shoots from the hip.
What? Because parts from China are so...
No, this Canada, from Canada and Mexico.
So if you're an automaker in the US even,
yes,
a lot of your parts are coming from Mexico or could be coming from Canada as well.
Yes.
And you're going to have to pay 25% more.
And that's going to shoot up
your
costs.
And so they push back.
You employ fewer people and you sell fewer cars.
Exactly.
Right.
So the supply chains are very diverse across, you know, America, Canada, and Mexico. So it was interesting that his, you know, press secretary and the... Because I was doing some stuff last night and it was like, oh, we were talking about tariffs. And it was like, oh, actually, them... So you're dealing with somebody who's incredibly unpredictable, shooting from the hip. It's also one of these things where it is hard to understate, and I'm sure everybody watching at home has the same feeling, how much the world has changed in just 3 weeks' time. I mean, that whole post-war consensus that we have built democracies on, we've built societies on, we've built our politics on, those threads have not just been pulled, the whole thing has been shattered now. And it's just incredible. And just looking at the news last night, where already you had, you know, Ukraine having their military aid suspended by America, then the news coming through that they were switching off their intelligence sharing with Ukraine, which is essentially saying, Ukraine, you can carry on fighting, but with one hand behind your back or a blindfold on. I mean, this stuff is absolutely extraordinary. And the fact that China has now got involved, you know, one of the things that he said to Zelensky in that appalling, bullying, awful, those scenes in the White House, is he said, you're playing with fire, you want World War III. It looks like him shooting from the hip. He is the one that is... We're now in a really scary, dangerous world.
So he's basically applying maximalist threats and bullying, frankly. And there's always the threat of force, which no other US leader would consider, would dream of doing this, because they were more consensual. They saw themselves as, in that phrase, leaders of the free world, and they wanted to bring people together more. Whereas Trump has rejected all of that and said, look, you're going to do it my way, or I'm going to do nasty things to you. And it's like a sort of mafioso-style bargain.
They're like gangsters. And also, it's fine for him. He can do that and pick on Zelensky, because Zelensky's in a very difficult position and there's been an invaded attack. China is in a very different... You know, China is a superpower as well. So Trump can sort of trash-talk China and talk tough to China. But if China do decide to retaliate, they are big beasts as well.
Yeah, they're much more powerful.
They're big beasts.
Although I have to say, the fact that they came out so strongly suggests to me that they're quite worried about this.
There was a chilling moment in the House of Lords yesterday. Peter Mandelson is our ambassador to Washington now, but they got some of the past ambassadors in to talk about this. And they were all on the same script. This is a seismic change. We can't take things for granted anymore. David Manning, who was our ambassador, we seem to have a president who's willing to bully or cajole the Ukrainians. We need to look very closely about what we now do. But he said it was even possible that Trump would end the US's nuclear cooperation deal with the UK. I mean, our nuclear weapons are deeply entwined with American nuclear weapons.
In Scotland.
We see that as part of our deterrence for action from, for example, Putin and other nuclear power, the Russians. But, I mean, when you start saying, can you rely upon America, not just on tariffs or aid in Ukraine, but on cooperation over nuclear weapons, I mean, this is astonishing.
We are off to the wacky races at this point. This is unbelievable. And last night, President Macron did a big national address. He made a speech. And it was really interesting, his language, because I think he was kind of hinting at that. He was basically saying...
I think we could actually play a shot of what he said.
So this was basically President Macron saying to the world and saying to his people, we want to hope for the best and we want to hope that America stays by our side, but we have to prepare for the absolute worst. And the absolute worst means, as you say, not just tariffs, not just a trade war, not just not supporting Ukraine, a full withdrawal of troops from Europe, maybe a disassociation in terms of our nuclear arsenal, and the potential as well of actually really allying with Russia over... There is a world in which you could see it's in America's advantage to have Russia dominate Ukraine and they split up the minerals and the spoils between them.
Just to put the other case, I think President Trump had a point when he said, you, Europe, you, NATO, have to step up more in terms of the costs. I think that's broadly agreed, and we've had this debate here in the UK about what, 2.5% GDP paying defence. But you're quite right, Aisha's quite right to say that the whole premise of the post-war consensus was that ultimately the US would be the backstop, would be the guarantor of our defence. And that's up for grabs.
Kwasi, I wanted to talk to you about what now is going to happen with the budget, because people are hearing lots and lots of money for Ukraine. And, if this gets worse, that tap is only going to be turned on more fully. Meanwhile, welfare cuts are coming. I mean, I know that the Conservative leader backs cutting the welfare budget, but it seems remarkable that a Labour government is going to go harder and faster on cutting the welfare.
I think this is a real problem, and we've discussed this here before, but you've got a situation where the growth figures won't be as strong as they were predicted last year, and there'll be a black hole, so the Chancellor will either have to reduce spending or increase taxes. And I suspect she will try and do a bit of both. I don't think, either one or the other will take the full load in terms of filling that hole. But I'm afraid for Labour chancellors, even for the Tories, reducing spending is very difficult. It's very controversial. And I think, particularly with welfare, where, people are very vulnerable, I think that'll be politically very difficult for Labour.
Yesterday, we ran a, online social media poll. Is it right to prioritise war over welfare? Surprise, surprise. People don't want war prioritised over welfare. Jeremy Corbyn, the former Labour leader, tweeted, "Labour could tax the super rich to end poverty, build social housing and fix our NHS. They're choosing to go after the worst off instead. For a while, many people didn't know what this government stood for. They do now. Tough choices for the poor, endless money for war." How much might this hit Labour's voters?
Well, I don't think words from Jeremy Corbyn are particularly going to keep Keir Starmer up at night. Keir Starmer very much distanced himself from Jeremy Corbyn. By the way, Jeremy Corbyn's been completely on the wrong side of this conflict, and right from the beginning was we shouldn't be going into he's not been as full.
He was very pro-Russia.
Support for. So I don't think he is the right person on this, quite frankly. However,
what do you think about his message?
Well, let's take it away from Jeremy Corbyn and look at the bigger issue. There's no doubt that this is going to be very, very difficult for Rachel Reeves. And by the way, it's not just cuts in welfare. I know the welfare is, we've just been talking about the criminal justice system. That is another unprotected department. You look at things, and we've just been talking, we want to build more prison places, we want to have more police officers, we've got to clear the court backlogs. You look at local government, we've got to get more money into adult social care and fix our potholes. So these cuts, and I think there are going to be quite severe cuts coming down the track, is going to have a big effect. Now, there's going to be people across the Labour movement who will resist these cuts and put a lot of pressure on Rachel Reeves. There'll be some people who say to Rachel Reeves as well, because of what we've just been talking about, and this has been 3 weeks that have really shaken the world order, everything has changed. Maybe it is now time to have a bigger conversation about tax. And, one of my listeners on my radio show, actually, and quite a lot of my listeners have said, we would be prepared to pay an extra penny on income tax if it was ring-fenced for things like the war, so it wasn't taken out of other government departments. Someone even called it the patriotic penny. But there will be other people as well who say, look, go after the wealthy. And
they will do that.
And Kwasi will know better than me. Look, I broadly think it would be good to look at that. However, what everyone tells me is that if you go after those people, and Ed, you'll be able to explain this to us, it's actually quite hard to get that money because they move their money internationally.
Exactly.
I don't know if that's the case. I'd like to think that if you were going after the poor, you would go after the very rich.
It used to be a Labour mantra that we go after the people with the broadest shoulders.
That's right.
Because the people with the broadest shoulders can bear the burden. But We've seen pensioners have their winter fuel allowance cut.
Yeah,
now
it's
we
quite
see
extraordinary.
welfare claimants being targeted.
But Ed will know this. The department will have a view as to how the rich, in inverted commas, can be impacted. And the problem, they've already retreated on some of their non-dom reforms because what they saw was that people were leaving in droves, very wealthy people. Now, if wealthy people leave, they don't pay any tax. And you'd much rather have them here paying some tax than them going off to Monaco, wherever it might be, and paying nothing.
But effectively, what the government's saying
balance.
is we're going to go after those who are less able to avoid the tax.
But the other thing that the government will have to be really careful about, to your point, is, look, yes, the geopolitics are huge and they are vital. There's no good choices, but there's no choice but to do this. But the real politics will kick in pretty hard. We've got local elections coming up, we've got mayoral elections, big elections in Scotland and Wales next year, and before we know it, we'll be pitch rolling towards the next general election. And that's where you're going to see pressure from parties like Reform coming in. If those potholes are not fixed, if people still can't see their doctor, if they can't get their mum and dad into a good care home, that is when the real politics of these cuts will come in as well. So they do have to think about both.
OK.
The problem is, on any welfare reform, getting people back to work and supporting them to do so is a really good thing to do. I think there's broad-based support for that. But if the Chancellor needs money quickly,
now,
the only easy way to get that is by cutting benefits for people rather than getting them back into work.
The budget.
And that is very, very difficult.
What do you think about raising 1p on income tax?
The patriotic penny.
The patriotic penny.
Why don't we put it to the viewers? And we'll let you know before 9 o'clock. Thank you both very much indeed for now. Right.